joined us for this session. Thank you for being a part of what I am sure will be a very exciting and illuminating discussion about Abanindranath Thakur, who's celebrating his 150th year from 2021 to 2022. It's a real privilege to be doing this at the Victoria Memorial Hall, and that too with Dr. Jayanta Sengupta and Professor Siva Kumar, who have already been introduced, so I won't go into that again. And the discussion itself will reveal why it's such a privilege. Thanks also to the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet for organizing this session. I mean, we have been having discussions about Abanindranath through the year, but to have this as the culminating session is really something special. So without further ado, I'll start with the first question, which essentially relates to the space that we are in, which is that Victoria Memorial, if I'm not wrong, has the largest collection of the single largest, or rather houses the single largest collection of Abanindranath Thakur anywhere. Is that right? And maybe if you could tell us a little bit about how this collection came into being.
Thank you, Sujaan, and good evening, everybody. And it's true, yes. Quite interestingly, although to many, the Victoria Memorial Hall sort of appears to be a museum containing mainly European perceptions of India. It started as an imperial institution. But not all the people know, many people do know, but not all know that we have actually built up, especially after independence, a very, very significant, one of the very best collections of Indian art. So the National Gallery of Modern Art in Delhi, for instance, they list the work of 9, I think now 11, Indian artists as the treasures of Indian art. Rabindra Tagore, Abanindranath Tagore, Gaganendranath Tagore, Nandalal Bose, all of these people are there, Amrita Shergill and all that. And it so happens that with the exception of one of those 9 or now 11 treasures, with the exception of Nicholas Roerich, Victoria Memorial Hall has the artworks of all of those master Indian artists. And the collection on Abanindranath Tagore is the key element in that. We do have currently the largest single collection of the works of Abanindranath Tagore. This is in two parts. One is the more famous part, the so-called Rabindra Bharati Society collection, which is owned by the Rabindra Bharati Society. But we obtained that collection, and that is a collection of more than 5,100 artworks, which has hundreds and hundreds of works by Abanindranath Tagore and Gaganendranath Tagore, and we obtained that collection on a long-term loan about 10 years ago. We have done exhibitions from them, so that we recently did a count, and we have in that collection, which is not ours in a proprietary sense, but in this, as part of this long-term loan, we can do everything. But we can exhibit them in India and abroad. We can create merchandise out of them. We can do online exhibitions, which we have already done, and so on and so forth. And by a recent count, we have 543 works by Abanindranath Tagore in that Rabindra Bharati Society collection. But before that, in the early teens, I mean the 2002, 3, these were, over a period of 3-4 years, the Victoria Memorial Hall actually acquired for the first time about 60 works of Abanindranath Tagore. And they were purchased from Abanindranath Tagore's grandson and his wife, Sumitendranath Tagore and Shamosri Tagore. And these are about 6. So counting our own collection and the Rabindra Bharati Society collection, we have more than 600 of Abanindranath Tagore's painting, which is huge. The next best single collection is the National Gallery of Modern Art, which has about 100 of Abanindranath's works. So we have more than 600, and even our own. I had some images. I don't know whether they're available for viewing as a slideshow. Maybe they are not, but
I think they are. Yeah.
Okay. Are they? Right, okay. So these that you can see, I can't see the screen properly, but these seem to be instances from our own collection of around 60 artworks by Abanindranath Tagore. None of these are major works. These are sketches, these are parts of scrapbooks and postcards and so on. But they show a very playful, sometimes even mischievous side of Abanindranath Tagore's creativity, which in general, the more famous, not all of the more famous and iconic works in the Rabindra Bharati Society collection don't have. So we have sketches. For instance, they are not here, but yeah, I mean, you will be able to see here 2 sketches by Abanindranath Tagore of his granddaughter. I don't know whether it was Maya or Rani, but he just captions it like, Dadamoni, Didimoni, chobi eke bhabche kobe dekha hobe. So the granddad is painting a picture of his granddaughter and wondering when he would meet her next. Similarly, there are 2 small sketches of Mukul De, Abanindranath's disciple, who was staying in Jorasanko for the time being. One is just a very, very rapidly done sketch of ants traveling on twigs with the caption, Katpiprer phouj choleche mukulke dante katte. An army of ants is traveling to just bite Mukul De. There is another of Mukul De sleeping in a corner of Jorasanko, and it says the caption is Mukul bhor panchtaye kumbhokarno. And which shows this character, this side of him, that he is probably up at 4 and just slipping into near Mukul De's bed and just sketching him asleep. So these playful sides of his character. But in the more iconic Rabindra Bharati Society collection, we have these more than 500 paintings, and we have representations of, I think, Professor Siva Kumar is here, he's the expert, but in my idea, most of the famous series, Abanindranath series of paintings, are represented in that Rabindra Bharati Society collection. The epitome of creativity in Abanindranath's works was probably his Arabian Nights series, and he painted probably 42 altogether, around that, and we have 36 of those. We have the early Krishna Lila series. We have scores of the Krishna Mangal series. We have more than 60 paintings from the Mask series, and the landscapes, the iconic landscapes of places like Shahjadpur near Dhaka, Mussoorie, Darjeeling, Dehradun, Ranchi, Puri, and so on. So all the, I would like to believe, and I would seek some kind of confirmation from Shivada here, that probably combining our own collection and the Rabindra Bharati Society collection together, we have the entire woof of Abanindranath Tagore's artistic range represented in it. So.
Thank you so much for that. And apart from the whole range, I think what you point out is also that, whereas some collections showcase the best of Abanindranath, here you get to see the person who was a continuous creator.
Absolutely.
And that seeps into every aspect of his life and his good humoredness. Professor Siva Kumar, I wanted to ask you, as Dr. Sengupta said, in your magisterial work, paintings of Abanindranath Tagore, you divide his career, or you trace 7 stages of his career. So would you say that the Victoria Memorial collections combined kind of give us a complete showcase of that, and how would you, or are there omissions that you feel there might be?
Well, I think it has the most comprehensive collection of Abanindranath's work anywhere. Of course, there's, with the Rabindra Bharati Society collection being transferred to the Victoria Memorial, there's nothing outside it which can match it in any way. There are only 3 collections which have important works by Abanindranath outside the Victoria Memorial. One, of course, is the NGMA, which has been referred to. The other is the Indian Museum and the Kalabhavan Museum in Shantiniketan. Now, the Indian Museum and the Kalabhavan Museum has important works from the early phases. The NGMA has some important works from the early phases and quite a nice collection of his late works. But the entire oeuvre of Abanindranath is, presented only here. And this is certainly the most important collection now. And it goes from the earliest works, which he did at the very beginning of, not his career, of his interest in art as a boy or as a little early teenager when he is trying to draw things, to the very last works he did. So this is a very important collection in which almost the entire career of Abanindranath is represented. And as we just heard, some of the very important series of works are represented in almost its totality. We don't know the couple of things which are missing from this collection. For instance, the Arabian Nights, we simply do not know where they are. So all that we know of now at the moment, both in the Sajatpur series and the Arabian Nights, are in this collection. And so in many ways, this is certainly the place that anybody who wishes to study Abanindranath now should come to. And that's without a doubt.
So just to kind of follow up on that, I think Binod Bihari Mukherjee made some catalog, did some work in cataloging that. Has there been any updates on that? What is the status of building, say, a complete catalog of whatever we know of Abanindranath to exist, maybe comparing it with previous catalogs to see if any have slipped between the cracks or if any new ones have come to light in recent years?
Yeah, really, I don't think any of us have managed to do better than Binod Bihari in terms of cataloging, because he had the advantage of both Nandalal and Abanindranath being present. And so I think that's the most exhaustive catalog. And from my own experience, I can say that is the most dependable catalog. So I have also, for my work, depended on his catalog quite a bit. And a very sizable number of works which are mentioned there, maybe 80% or more, is in the book. So at the moment, the most extensive documentation, unfortunately, is this book. And what is left out there is what are in private collections. And quite a number of them which are probably not, we do not know where they exist now, but we have had access to older reproductions and we have reproduced that. So in a sense, that is at the moment the published work where you have a total spread.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm also thinking in terms of works that may not have been considered, like for instance, as Dr. Sengupta was saying, for instance, the sketches or things that may not have fallen in the, within that definition earlier.
Well, that is also not represented in full there.
Right.
because that will be almost an impossible task, really. I mean, to undertake, because all these artists gifted away a part of their thing, some more, some less. But there are probably many which have been gifted away. I mean, once I was in Bombay, and I saw a number of little late postcards in Pandols. Now, I don't know what happened to them later. They, as usual, most galleries do, they promise to send you images and then they forget. So probably it has been sold, and some very interesting texts were also there. So there is a lot that we will keep discovering. I mean,
of course.
So I'm sure there will be many, many more things that will come. And occasionally we see some things which we couldn't trace, I mean, are now coming into the auction houses. We knew they existed, but we couldn't trace the originals, and once in a while I see them popping up.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that point. Dr. Sengupta, I mean, we have discussed our mutual love of Abanindranath as a writer, because, I mean, of course, here we are talking about the Victoria Memorial Collection, but we have shared this fascination that we have with his, not just his, more fairy tale-like stories, but his histories and his memoirs as well. So would you like to dwell a couple of minutes on what you feel of him as a writer of these stories, perhaps?
Yes, of course, absolutely. He was my favorite writer growing up. Maybe I was not very conscious of it at that time, but by the time I was in class 10 and writing my papers in Bengali in my secondary examination. In fact, there was an essay on your favorite author, and I wrote about Abanindranath. Now, the reason why he was my favorite writer, thinking back, is that obviously when you pick up a reading habit, as a child, you don't really have a sense of what literature means. You are reading tales and stories, whether they are Ramayana and Mahabharata, or Tuntunir Boi, or Thakumar Jhuli, or the Brothers Grimm. So the earliest books by Abanindranath that I read as a child were Shakuntala and Nalok and Khirer Putul and all that, and I loved them. But I don't really remember my own response to reading them. What I remember, though, is just when I was a little older, maybe around 10 or maybe 11, then I read Raj Kahini and Buro Angla. And in Raj Kahini, and I still remember the description of, in the story Bappadittu, of him marrying a princess while playing his childhood playmate, Sholanki Rajkumari, and then he tries to seek her out through the rest of his long life. And they sang a song together. And when he dies at the age of 100, as Abanindranath says, on his funeral pyre, round that funeral pyre, the old playmate whom he had tried to seek out for almost a century appears and goes round the pyre singing that song, Aaj ki Anando Jhulone Jhuloto Shamaro Chando. And as a child, that struck me. The whole idea of unrequited love, the pathos and the tragedy of that moment. And I remember the last line, the last passage of Raj Kahini, where Prithviraj, is traveling on a horse, and the dawn is breaking, and it's a beautiful dawn. And as the entire expanse of Rajputana, the desert, sort of seems to echo and resonate with the tunes of the Raga Bhairavi, at that excruciatingly beautiful moment, Prithviraj topples from his horse and dies. And I still remember, again, the poignancy of that moment. I now describe it as a poignancy. I was not aware of it. But I think that changed something in me. And that was an important rite of passage in understanding what the tragedy, and, this is a beautiful day to die on. That sense, in fact, dawned on me for the first time. And of course, Buro Angla, in which I grew up in a family climate where I thought of myself as a Bangal, as somebody who had come from Purba Bongo. And in that sort of crafted identity, I found echoes in Buro Angla and its evocation of Cholonbil and all that rural East Bengal. So yes, Abanindranath Tagore was critical in my rites of passage as a child too. Perhaps somebody who began to appreciate literature as literature.
And he is, of course, a very visual storyteller. And through his images also tells stories. So it kind of cuts both ways.
Absolutely. He described himself as Obin Thakur Chobi Lekhe, somebody who paints stories. Who writes paintings, right? And it's also true of the other way around, because his paintings are also the tellings of stories.
Which is what I wanted to also ask you about, Professor Siva Kumar, which is that this element of telling stories through images as well as writing stories that you can see in front of your eyes whenever you think of them. Do you feel that Abanindranath is at times limited in terms of his? Do you see his, say the Arabian Nights series or the Krishna Leela series? Do you see them as illustrations, or do you see them as something that goes beyond illustrating a narrative?
No, this is absolutely true that his literary texts are visually vivid, and there are wonderful images, just like the one you said. And you can see the pathos of that image that you referred to probably matches the pathos of the death of Shah Jahan. So there are these, or maybe the end of the day where there is against the sky, a camel with all its load is, falling on its front feet. So probably it's going to kneel down or lie down now, something like that. But nothing else is said, but you have this wonderful view. But this whole idea of that Abanindranath being some kind of a literary painter is too simplistic, because the relation between writing and visual imagery in Abanindranath is much more complex. And there is a constant dialogue between writing and image making going on both in his literature as well as in his painting. So it's a very complex dialogue, and there are many complex dialogues that are going in his work continuously. This is one of them. But you can also see a dialogue between the indigenous and the colonial or the transnational kind of thing. That is another level of dialogue. So you have multiple dialogues of this kind going on, and between the visual and the literary is one particular dialogue that goes on. And there is if you go through his paintings alone, literature, I had read quite a lot, and maybe I have some very naive views, but I don't want to express them, but I am probably more comfortable commenting on the pictorial part of it. So when his earliest work were in the normal sense illustrations, which is not Krishna Leela, but the works he did based on Swapna Prayan or on Rabindranath's Chitrangada, and they are in the sense illustrations, that is, the image is subsidiary to the literary text. When it comes to Krishna Leela, it is already moving into the domain of narration. You take one step further and you see those works which are inspired by Kalidas and Mughal history, then the narration takes on a more visual dimension. It's not literary anymore. Kalidas's, the Meghdooda or other paintings that he does is actually not an illustration to the text at all. It's more evocative. go further, you see his Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. I mean, there the images are visual equivalents to the moods that the poems evoke. So the relationship is changing again. And you can see, I mean, similarly for Falguni and so on. And you take something like the Bengal Actors series, which sort of followed it immediately. It's no more literary in that sense, although it refers to Jatra, but it doesn't have any literary background. And then the literary kind of moves away, the evocative takes over for a while. You see more complex relationships then happening in the Mass series, for instance, or the purely visual. I think it's most visible in the Sajadpur landscape paintings. Then comes the Mask, where he is trying to get back to the literary, because it is a text, it is also a performance, and there are complex relations between this, and the Arabian Nights, where narration comes back. But by this time, he is also a person who can do the most sophisticated visual imagery. So there is a constant, very dynamic dialogue between the literary and the visual, which is going on. Now, and this dialogue doesn't stop there. It continues right up to the Kudur Jatra text kind of thing. And by then, it's all turned upside down. Already by the time you come to the Arabian Nights, it is a parallel text. It is not illustration anymore. It is subversive in many ways. So the relationship between the text and the image is completely altered. So he's constantly having this dialogue, but he's not standing still at any moment in his career. If you look at the literature, you can probably see the same thing. I mean, he is, I would say, even a greater experimenter with literature. I have no locus standi to say this, but my own reading is that he was perhaps, even in painting, you can have parallels. But I don't know if there are many parallels, I mean, in literature, where, for instance, for the time, something like Kajanjir Khatha, I mean, like you forget about the narration, the stories, and the verbal and the material aspect of sound takes over. And then you go maybe something like Mashi. It's a totally different thing. And there are stories at that time which anticipates literature of the 1960s. So he was a great experimenter in literature. And I would think what he did in his Jatras was something he wanted to do as a painter, but he didn't actually succeed to the same extent. So there are both these things. This dialogue between the visual and the literary goes on both in literature and in painting. And in some instances, my own feeling is that the experimental side of Abanindranath as a writer sometimes succeeded more than that of a thing. It's not to say that what he did as a painter is insignificant. It's tremendously great. Very, very, very few painters anywhere in the world has achieved this. But I think the writer Abanindranath probably managed to take one more step ahead.
That's a really interesting point, and I mean, reason for us, I think, also to go back and revisit these texts and possibly attempt a few more translations of them as well. Of course, when I speak of literature and visual arts, it also, I mean, I excluded performance because that's also a very important part of his work. I mean, in terms of painting the Jatras and the theater series and the masks, for instance. Just to take a slightly more, I mean, explore a critical reading of Abanindranath, perhaps. I mean, one of the things that Abanindranath tried to do when he thought of discarding the colonial art education that was available to his generation was to create this, create this kind of pan-Asian cultural identity through his art, right? Where he was looking to Persianate traditions, where he was looking to Japan and trying to kind of unite them under the sign of his visual arts. So are there silences there, in terms of, I mean, I know that he does miniature, but I mean, he replicates those styles as well, but do you see any silences? Do you see any kind of reticence when it comes to certain cultures over others? Was it really as syncretic as he hoped it would be? I mean, this is just a speculative question in case either of both of you wish to think about it.
No, I think Professor Siva Kumar is the right person to.
Okay. Well, obviously there will be silences. I mean, that's bound to happen. And then Abanindranath didn't take upon himself the idea of reviving Indian art in its entirety or reviving Indian art at all. I mean, he took up things which went along with his sensibility. He was a person who was pursuing his own sensibilities, and to do that, he found certain traditions very useful. The Mughal miniatures, for instance, but he never left the realist training that he received as an young artist. He built upon it, he transformed it. So he found the Mughal miniature tradition as one important component that helped him to transform his understanding of realism. Okay? Right. He wanted to free himself from the structures of Renaissance painting. And how can you keep realism and still free yourself from that rigid structures of realism which Renaissance brought him? So the Mughal was one way of doing it. The Japanese came in as another dimension. The Persian miniatures, I mean, came in as a third dimension to that. So he accepted things, he appropriated things that was useful to him, but not the entirety of any of these things. In fact, there are many things in Indian tradition that he didn't pay attention to at all. Some he liked as a connoisseur. For instance, Jayanta. I mean, he didn't pay enough attention to that. He didn't do murals at all. I mean, he wanted to keep things to that intimate level as an artist, and the murals are absolutely public kind of art. So he didn't pay attention in spite of Havel and Sister Nivedita insisting on Indian artists doing public art. So he didn't pay attention to that. He didn't actually, he admired some of Indian sculpture, but he didn't pay attention to that. He didn't probably admire Rajput painting very much because it didn't have that kind of realism which he admired. So there were many things that he didn't admire. Even in Japanese, there were many aspects that he didn't really pay attention to. So he was somebody who was pursuing his own sensibilities and choosing things from traditions which would help him to go ahead.
Thank you for that. And of course,
I think I would just add my very sort of layman's take on this. I don't know about the silences in terms of his creative work, but I think, to me personally, what Abanindranath does through his, through his art and through his literature is sort of, kind of foregrounds this very hybrid, mixed Indo-Islamic nature of our identities. Because the colonial sociology of India, obviously, that makes these allusions to the so-called glorious ancient Indian Aryan past, but sort of plays down the Mughal period, the period of Islamic rulers as such, because the entire colonial history is in terms of disintegration, chaos, plunder, mismanagement, and so on, so that they can project themselves as the saviors. So Abanindranath actually is somebody who is drawing from the Vaishnava tradition, he is drawing from Gita Govinda, he is drawing from the Mangal Kavyas, he is drawing from the Arabian Nights and the Persian literature. He typically signs his own name in the Devanagari style and so on. So this is exactly a reflection of the mixed and synthetic, almost Catholic nature of our own identities, of our own cultural synthesis. And to me, Abanindranath is the epitome of that kind of synthesis.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. I mean, he, of course, apart from the Devanagari, he also uses something that is a Nastalic interpretation of the Bangla script to sign his name, so as also the Bangla script itself in its usual form. Question to both of you, I think, we have been having several exhibitions. I mean, of course, the major exhibition that happened at the Victoria Memorial was in 2015 or 16?
The first exhibition from the Gaganendranath Tagore paintings, curated by Professor Ratan Parimu, was in January, February 2012.
2012, I see.
Yes, and then in 2015, we had another, this was a major exhibition on Rabindra Tagore paintings. I think 16 from our own collection and 107, I think, from the Rabindra Bharati Society collection. This was a selection made by Professor Parimu again, but it was inaugurated by Professor Siva Kumar, who gave a fascinating lecture on the day of the inauguration. And then over time, we have exhibited, for example, when there was this hue and cry over Bharat Mata Ki Joy, we purposely did a one single object exhibition on the Bharat Mata. And Professor Sugata Bose gave a lecture on the symbolisms of that painting. And then in our renovated galleries, we put, I think, 5 Abanindranath Tagore paintings. They have now disappeared because of our big Netaji exhibition, but they will come back sooner than later, hopefully.
And you've also done online exhibitions.
Yes, exactly. And the exhibition done in 2015 is available on Google Arts and Culture. And during the pandemic, when our museum was closed, we in fact collaborated with the Delhi Art Gallery and then the Center for Studies in Social Sciences to do a very interesting and innovative online exhibition on Abanindranath, Gaganendranath, and Sunayani Devi. In fact, the moderator today was part of this, and we had fascinating insights given to us during that online lecture by Professor Shiva Kumar and Professor Tapati Gaur Thakurta and many others. So that was one of our most well-received and innovative online exhibitions also.
Just 2 questions to wrap up the discussion, then we can open it to the audience as well. One is, do you see is there any possibility of an exhibition in the foreseeable future? And the second question again is that, is Abanindranath's art today of interest only to art historians and art enthusiasts, or do you see in it possible inspiration for artists, performers as well? So
may I answer the first question, and then are there possibilities of a physical exhibition in the future? Well, yes. I mean, in what way? That is confidential information, because if I tell you now, I have to kill you. But I can give you this clue that yes, the next year we hope to do a big exhibition physically in the Victoria Memorial Gallery on a series of Abanindranath Tagore's paintings, which is related to a Central Asian literary theme. And it is going to be curated by somebody who is within a sort of 20-foot radius. So that's the only clue that I can offer to you. And if anybody is good enough to have guessed it, the prize will be the exhibition itself. So that's all I have to say.
Wonderful. Something to look forward to, and I hope to remain alive, of course. About the question about whether do you think that there is material there which artists today can respond to? I mean, not just visual artists, but performers, writers, etc.
Well, I mean, in the literary sense, of course, I don't think any major painter would be trying to repeat what he does.
Of course.
Because to repeat history, we have to be fools. I mean, but there is much to learn from Abanindranath. Now, one of the things is that, which I had already suggested, that he was a self-reflective artist. That all these shifts that we see from the beginning till the end of his career, where it's not moving in a linear fashion, he is constantly looking back at what he did and critiquing. He is pursuing his sensibilities, but he's pursuing it with a full awareness of the historical times he is living in. Now, to do this itself is a very modern challenge, and no other artist of his time has done this as successfully as Abanindranath. And many of the challenges he took upon himself and the answers that he produced through his work are worth pursuing. For instance, when you kind of try to pursue your own sensibilities, now that has to be historicized. And when he did that, for him, probably while he was, that itself was a modernist project, he didn't subscribe to one of the most important modernist kind of rules, that is that an artist has to stick to the innate potentiality of the medium that he's using, a kind of purism, which was a tenet in modernism, especially modernist painting. He refused to follow that. And that time, of course, when people looked at him, and maybe in the 40s, Indian critics dubbed him as a literary painter, an illustrator, and so on. But from 1980s onwards, when artists moved into a phase that we call postmodernism, that looked the most sensible thing to do. And he was making both literature and painting part of a larger cultural expression. And each painting or piece of writing was a text in dialogue with a historical and cultural context. Now, these are things that most contemporary artists of today are trying to do. In fact, if one looks, the time that we began to look seriously at Abanindranath, if you asked about Binod Bihari, he was probably one who took him seriously in a way and who painted very differently from him. The other person who really tried to look at him was another artist, Subramanian. And he wrote a small essay, which is the first essay in which you see Abanindranath's Arabian Nights as a reflection of contemporary life in Kolkata. Now, compared to that, all the other historians, unfortunately, even Professor Paramu, who was the first to write a critical, comprehensive study of Abanindranath, didn't pay attention to some of these things, like the Arabian Nights. He just had a small paragraph in the whole study, kind of thing. So you can see that there was much to be discovered. And we discovered it in the 80s, when you have this whole school of modern painting called the narrative painters came up. And when they tried to look at the visual in relation to literature and in relation to culture, then you suddenly realize there was Abanindranath who in 1930 did this, who anticipated this. So there is a lot more. And then when we published the Kuddur Jatra, I mean, many artists wrote back to me saying, okay, what a wonderful text we are discovering. Now, these included the most contemporary artists. So there is a lot that we need to discover. There are a lot of lessons that we can learn from him. But may not be, we will never do a Bengal school painting out of it. But there is much more. And Abanindranath is much more than the Bengal school itself. And I think that's what we can learn.
Of course. Thank you so much, Professor Shiva Kumar. We'll open this open the session to questions from the audience, if there are any. Yes, sir. We have a mic somewhere.
Good evening, everyone. My regards to Dr. Sengupta, R. Shiv Kumar ji, and Sri Sujaan Mukherjee. This hardly any question. It's not a question proper. My humble request is that during the future exhibition, if the Indian Museum, Victoria Memorial, and our grand Vishwa Bharati Kala Bhavan could jointly bring out a booklet on Abanindranath's painting and put it up on sale for visitors, that would be lovely. Especially for art lovers who are not very tech savvy, who cannot download on the Google or
That really
say
would be
my grandmother's friends, they are not tech savvy. They can easily, but they love to treasure books. So if for book lovers and for art lovers, if you could please bring out a booklet and put it up on sale for the future and link it up with the future exhibition as a tribute to Dr. Sri Abanindranath.
Of course, of course.
Thank you so much.
In fact, even before we had been discussing a collaboration on Rabindranath Tagore's painting between the Indian Museum and the Victoria Memorial, right back from 2014-15 onwards, I had been in discussion with the National Gallery of Modern Art, which was then led by a different director, Professor Rajiv Lochan, about a collaborative exhibition bringing the NGMA collection and the Victoria Memorial Hall collection together. So that didn't happen at that time for many reasons, but now, I have again brought up this possibility, and there is a good possibility, we might say, that in the near future, if not next year, but sometime soon, we can probably arrange a combined blockbuster exhibition of Victoria Memorial, Indian Museum, and NGMA. Yes.
It's a mouth-watering prospect.
Yes, it is.
Any other questions, comments, observations? Okay, so I think since we are almost at the end of our session, the time allotted to our session, this has really been doesn't like to stop talking about Abanindranath, especially with people who are so much in love with his work and also, who have worked on him for so long. But I think I'll draw this to a close with my thanks to Dr. Jayanta Sengupta and Professor Shiva Kumar. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your expertise on this. Thanks also to the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet, and thank you to this wonderful audience who joined us for this discussion. So in the coming years, we'll look forward to this exhibition, to the publication, and many new creative inspirations that emerge from Abanindranath's work. So thank you and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the lovely session. With this, we come to the end of the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet 2022 at the Western Quadrangle. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll now move on to the Victoria Memorial Hall main steps for the final performance for the festival. That's a classical sitar recital by Ustad Sujat Khan. Thank you so much for joining us and have a good night.